here. Welcome to Exhibitionistas. Today we talk about Lauren Halsey's exhibition Imagine That at the Serpentine Gallery, curated by Lizzie, Carey-Thomas and Bayley. It's a maximalist environment that led us to a discussion about art, freedom, identity, revolution, care. It also allowed us to find out more about the myths and origins of the term Afro-Futurism, which I have to say surprised us a great deal. This episode unexpectedly located us as spectators in our freedoms and in our edges, as you will see. It also reminded us that one of the things that connects us is probably the ability to dream without systematically placing our own desires at the center of dreamscapes. You know, dreamscapes are not always about us, and world making is a joint effort, specific at times to groups that not always had the possibility of even having one. Dreams are actually realities in the making, but this is really what we've learned by visiting and talking and researching this incredible exhibition. And we also kind of got to the conclusion that all of this may very well be one of the facets of joy. So, without further ado, come with me. Let's push the doors of the Serpentine and discover this incredible world of Lauren Halsey. Hello and welcome to Exhibitionistas. If you're new here, this is the only conversational podcast where we visit solo exhibitions in London to discuss them here in this recorded space from an art specialist perspective, me, Joanna Piar-Neves, contemporary art writer and curator, and from an outsider's, albeit passionate and many times erudite point of view. I'm talking about my lovely co-host, who I will let introduce herself.
Oh, so kind. And yes, I'm Emily Harding, an art lover and an exhibition goer. I don't know how erudite, but it's a great pleasure to view exhibitions and discuss them with you, Joanna, and with the dear listeners, a phrase that I am picking up from you very much so. So this exhibition is Lauren Halsey, Imagine That, at the Serpentine, and it gives a lot to consider, emphasis on a lot, because there is a maximalist theme going on throughout it. So it's at the Serpentine until the 23rd of February in London. It's a site-specific installation, which makes it, I think, kind of additionally interesting. It's also really inspired by funk, the group Parliament in particular, which I loved because, you know, you can kind of go down a rabbit hole of funk on Tidal or Spotify or wherever you stream your music.
Did that ring a bell for you?
Oh God, yeah.
Oh wow.
100%.
I was wondering.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, no, it was really fun and funkadelic, you know, all those bands. But for me personally, it was this exhibition was a real roller coaster. So I was super excited to see it when I kind of saw it online. And then I had a bit of a disorienting experience within the exhibition. And I was like trying to land on where I felt about it. It was, you know, I left with it still pretty up in the air. And then, you know, I did research for the podcast, and I feel now like I'd like to return to Halsey's perspective with more knowledge than I had before. Like that could be an interesting world to go back to, because as we said, there's a lot. So there certainly would have been a lot that I would have missed and a lot that deserves more attention.
Totally agree. I also want to go back and experience it again, for sure. It's one of those where this episode makes so much sense for it because there is so much to find out about Lauren Halsey, about the exhibition, about the choices that were made, the project itself, what it links to. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, and I'm really can't wait to dig in. But before we go into it, I just want to inform our listeners, our dear listeners, that we're now officially 1-year-old babies.
Oh,
Exhibitionista.
Yeah,
Exactly.
tottering around, holding on to the coffee table. Yeah.
Exhibition's a toddler. So on the 25th of January of 2024, we dropped our first episode.
Aw.
And I think you should check this episode if you discovered us midway. I'm just going to tell you that Emily was manhandled by a security guard while trying to get some nudes. So if
Yeah.
this doesn't pique your interest, I don't know what will. Ah, gosh, can you remember 1 year ago?
Oh, innocent, sweet innocence. Yeah,
The
the
innocence.
Marina Abramovich exhibition, yeah, will live in my memory forever.
But more importantly, I would like to thank you, our listeners, followers, subscribers. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening. And please, if you want us to continue to grow and to develop, you can do lots of things to support us. So you can, first of all, subscribe to the podcast. You know, I know it sounds very abstract, but it does
Mm,
count.
yeah, totally.
It's really important. You can leave comments, and there's platforms that allow you to. Spotify, in particular, you can leave comments there. So far, we only have one. It's in the Mike Kelly episode, and it says, "Ladies, pick up a brush."
Yeah.
So I would really urge you to contribute with other kinds of comment. I mean, we really love that one. We cherish it. It's the first
Yeah.
one. But I didn't know personally that Spotify had comments. So that's why I'm talking about it, because we are not all aware of what we can do and how we can interact with podcasts. And actually, you can, and you can send us ideas. You can give feedback as well, which is always important. So please contribute.
Yeah.
Because when we go to the analytics of Spotify, there's that one comment. It's there. It's
Yeah.
looking at us all the time.
And as much as we love it, we'd like it to have friends, you know?
Yeah, I think it feels lonely,
Yeah, exactly.
as it should, honestly. But anyway, another thing you can do is to leave us a rating. To leave us a review. Tell us what you like about the podcast. You can also tell us what you don't like about the podcast, which, of course, we have to urge you to do, but be kind, be nice. We do listen, and we're very
Mm.
interested in knowing how we can make things better, what you like, what you prefer, what you want more of, what you want less of. Ratings are very important as well. Another easy thing to do is just tell your friends about us. Just
Mm.
talk about the podcast, put the word out there. And finally, another thing that you can do, and obviously this is really important to us as well, is to support us financially. Obviously, we want to continue doing this and we want to grow. And for that, we can also rely on fan support. So we have a Patreon page. You can be a member of our page for a really, really small donation monthly. But we are also adding a PayPal account where you can do just a one-off donation, because I know it's easier for a lot of people to do that. So we will have that in our newsletter, in our Instagram account, in our website, and in the show's notes. So please think of us. I know Christmas is behind us and January is a tough month, but we don't need big donations. Lots of ways to support us. Independent journalism is what we do, and therefore we really, really need your support.
So tell me, Joanna, what was your week in culture like?
Well, I just got back from France, from a small town called Amiens, where the Frac Picardie is located. So at Drawing Now, so I'm artistic director of Drawing Now Paris, which is an art fair dedicated to drawing that takes place every year in March, last week of March. So we have a partnership with the Frac, and we do that because it's a collection and a space that is exclusively dedicated to contemporary drawing. So I curate 2 shows there every year. more or less around the time of the art fair in March. And that's what I did last week. And this year I focused on the notion of codes and notations for the exhibition. When written words are no longer enough to convey what you want to convey, think music and dance notations, but also mathematical signs, etc. And
Mm.
I took inspiration from Emily, a really important artist in France called Jacques Villeglé, who passed away in 2018, I think, at 90.
Mm.
He was a really, really interesting artist. He was an affichiste as well, which means that he would retrieve posters from the street and make collages with them. He's quite an established artist by now in France, and a historical one. And he also had a project that he started in 1969 called the Socio-Political Alphabet, which was composed of signs that were socially and politically motivated and that he would find in the streets and that he would collect.
Cool. I love that.
It's so compelling, you
I
know?
mean, yeah, that's really cool because it's like you can think of like the peace sign and, people putting that around everywhere in the 60s, but there's so much more and so much more depth to them now. I mean, a friend of mine is a street artist and she does a lot of stickers
Yeah.
with various kind of different signs on them. And, through her Instagram account, you see so many. You see the variety of different signs that there are. And wow, what a great idea to kind of really capture and distill those.
Wow. Maybe we can put her Instagram account in the show's notes.
Yeah,
What's her
we
name?
sure can. Her name is Paula Finbo, but the Instagram account, I think it's Jane Roe Revolution. But
All right.
we'll put
We'll
that in
we'll leave
the
it in the show notes. And that's exactly what he took inspiration from, but obviously also from slogans and 69 was that period was quite a revolutionary period and a period of protest. So of course he kind of drew inspiration from that. And the cultural highlight for me, I'm getting there, is when I was shown at the FRAC a book of Benjamin Perret, who was a French poet, with Villeglé's alphabet. Oh, there's a fox peeing in a bush right outside my window. Excuse
classy.
me for being very distracted by it. Okay, picking up again. So, Benjamin Perret, French poet. So, the text that was published in this little booklet, it was called The Poet's Dishonor. It was written in 1945 against the use of poetry by politically motivated agendas, namely the communists. So Benjamin Perret was a Trotskyist. He was part of the Surrealist movement as well at some point. But it was also against criticism of poetry as being escapism because, and I love this sentence of the text, quote, they scorn dreams in favor of reality as if reality were not one and the most overwhelming of its aspects, unquote.
Mm,
The text is quite something. I really
yeah.
urge you to read it. You can find it in English online. But more importantly, Perret has a stance against poetry as a liberating tool and
Mm,
equates fascist and democratic poetry, or communist, obviously. That was kind of the aim of his text. So he equates both. Both are chained to the ideas of God or nation or both. So, of course, this is very contained by the period that he was writing about. He was living in Mexico at the time. He had look him up, he had such an incredible
yeah.
life. So he was against the poetry being attached to ideas of belonging rather than total and unconditional revolutionary irreverence. And we go back to so many things discussed in past episodes, right? Such
Yeah.
as, when we talked about American curator Helen Molesworth's comment about how we went from ideas of revolution and anarchy, even in exhibitions and in art, to ideas of caring and community in art spaces and exhibitions in
Mm.
particular, which falls right into the subject today,
Totally. Oh my
right?
gosh. Yeah.
It really
Yeah.
is. It really is the subject. But to be honest, I was really mostly taken by the book that I kind of had in my hands. It was published in 2004. And the thing is, you managed to read it despite the subverted graphics of the letters.
Mm.
So, for example, A becomes the anarchist A, O is the swastika inside a sort of multifaceted, kind of roundish shape.
Hmm.
And you can read the text, but you read it in a sort of syncopated manner. So it's as if your reading undid the words even more and created a whole other meaning. So I was just so taken by
Wow.
this book. It was such a special moment in the week.
It feels like there could not be something more up your street, I
Yeah,
mean,
if you know
like,
me.
it has yeah, it has, like, your love of just, like, words and letters and the written text, and then to have that absolutely infused with all sorts of other abstract meaning through these symbols. I can imagine your joy and pleasure in that.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I was so, yeah, it was a special moment. Thank you, Christophe at the FRAC, who showed me the book. They have an amazing person who takes care of all the books and all the catalogs. And they always have books available that connect to the exhibition that they're showing, curated by Christophe, but also by the artists and the curators who are there. So it is a really great institution to work with, and I had a wonderful time. So, but how about
Great.
you?
Yeah, for me, pretty low key, but I finished a book from one of my favorite authors, Louise Erdrich. The Night Watchman is the name of the book. She won a Pulitzer for it in 2021. And it's, for those who may have cracked the spine of an Erdrich novel before and found them a challenge, because she is really known for using magical realism in her work,
Mm,
and kind of she messes with narrative timelines quite a bit. She's one of those authors where you really have to pay attention.
yeah.
It's hard to be nodding off to sleep in her works usually. This book uses a more straight narrative structure, and there is some of the great symbolism and sort of magical realism that she's known for in there, but it's a little bit more in the background in this one. But she's a Native American from Minnesota, so from my home state, and she is totally a local luminary. And the book follows the story of a night watchman, which is roughly based on her grandfather, I think it was, who worked at this jewelry settings plant that had been put on the reservation. His real kind of purpose was working with the Native Council to resist the federal government's push to erase Native heritage and rights. I mean, there was, obviously the story of Native Americans is long and rich, but with the US government, they'd been pushed and pushed and squeezed into these reservations. And then at a certain point, they were like, oh, no, we're just going to say that you're Americans now. So anybody can come into your lands and buy them. And, you've been horribly treated, and, you've had genocide and, you know, massive disenfranchisement economically, educationally, etc.,
And culturally.
and culturally. But now this particular move was to just say, we're not going to have any protected lands because we're just going to see you as regular Americans. And so obviously there was a big push against this. It's a real thing that happened in history, and she's building up this novel around that historical thread. It takes place in North Dakota and a bit in Minnesota, and it's just another great offering of a Native writer telling the story of what has happened to Native Americans throughout time, and in very recent history too.
Wow. I'm so glad that, Native American voices recently have reached some of the mainstream platforms, and that's absolutely amazing. And it's great because, the story has been very hushed And it's good to know, a bit more about it, but also a bit more about the present and the future of these communities, and not just kind of like stick them to an idea of the past that is very tokenizing and romanticized. And yeah, that's amazing. I think I'm going to have a look. I hope I have time to pick up a novel at some point this year.
Yeah. Yeah, I would super, super recommend it. Yeah,
Amazing.
she's brilliant.
Okay. So we are about to push the Serpentine's South Gallery doors and enter the topical world of Lauren Halsey, if not for the fact that she is LA based and wildfires have literally consumed a part of
Mm.
the city and killed many people there, which is a terrible, terrible thing that has happened in this turn of the year. But anyway, moving on to Lauren Halsey, do you want to introduce us to her, Emily?
Yeah, it's my great pleasure, and I really am so happy that we're doing an episode that is so LA based, considering the heartbreak that's happening there now. I mean, obviously, as you say, people have died, but people have lost everything, and there's something very specific about the loss with fires as well. It's
Mm,
like a flood comes, the things are kind of mostly still there, only in a different form, and you choose to then get rid of them. But it's like you just see ash heaps everywhere of people's lives,
mm.
and yeah, it's just been so heartbreaking. So I'm going to start by citing a great write-up in the Guardian about the exhibition by Kadish Morris. But there are so many other reviews of the exhibition and there's info on Lauren Halsey out there. I saw this super charming short on YouTube of an interview with Hans Ulrich Oberist and Halsey. And at a certain moment in the short, you see the both of them on stationary bikes, which was really cute. So I really enjoyed a podcast episode as well with Halsey and George Clinton, who's the founder of Parliament, super famous funk band from the late 60s. They're still going, to be honest, but that was kind of when their heyday was sort of late 60s, early 70s.
He's in his 80s now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's
Absolutely incredible.
this interview between the two of them. Honestly, look it up. It's on the David Zwirner podcast. I think it's called Dialogues. Through this episode that we're having now, it will become clear why that connection is so important. But the interview between Clinton and Halsey is just beautiful. It's like people across generations, different sort of artistic mediums, but have this lively sense of connection, and yeah, it's really really nice. And he's just like a super sweet guy, yeah, super sweet old, artistic elder, really.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And not to jump the gun, I think that's one of the strengths of Lauren Halsey, isn't it? Because she really is looking into a past and different generations before her and also ahead of her. But
yeah.
that's kind of one of the moving things about her, I find.
Yeah, totally, totally. So Lauren Halsey was born in LA in 1987, more specifically South Central LA, which is where much of her work is physically and conceptually centered. As she grew up, her dad was an accountant, her mom was a school teacher who apparently brought home lots of craft supplies home for Halsey to play with, which again is a feature of this exhibition in particular. You can kind of draw a line there. Her first love was basketball, which is also reflected in the exhibition, but her parents really pushed a more academic route. She eventually graduated with a BFA from the California Institute of Arts, aka CalArts, as did Mike Kelly and Judy Chicago from other recent episodes. And for me personally, it was kind of fun to be like, oh, I think I'm seeing the vibe. I mean, there is a thing that was going on there that feels very specific. Would you agree?
I was
Or
expecting that comment because when we started with LA was through Judy Chicago. And I remember expecting you to be super knowledgeable about LA, California, the scene.
yeah,
And I forget that the United States bigger than Europe. I mean,
Yeah.
you're from Minnesota, for Christ's sake. So you just
Yeah.
are discovering with a whole lot of insight compared to me, obviously, and probably being even more extra careful to not contain things and characteristics too quickly. But I was wondering, how you would feel about having done, like, this is the third episode about that scene.
The West, in the American West, has a fascination and a connection to land and space that is different than the rest of the country. I mean, if you think of like the great novelists, Steinbeck or Wallace
Mm,
Stegner, I mean, these
mm,
people who, were California writers to their bones, or American West writers to their bones, really.
mm-hmm,
And, you certainly see that in Judy Chicago
mm,
with like the colorful explosions of, the land projects and things like
mm-hmm,
that. And I mean, Lauren Halsey's really different. She is not, she's not reflecting the natural environment as much, but environment is really at the heart of the work that she's doing, and representing that environment rather than an internal idea or something necessarily political. I mean, there are internal ideas and it is political in a way, but
and
there's a
Mike Kelly
yeah,
too. The
yeah,
expansion
yeah,
of the projects in time and space of Mike Kelly, although he's not originally from California
yeah, he's
or from the
Detroit.
West
Yeah.
Coast. He comes from Detroit.
And there's something like, I mean, I think maybe with Mike Kelly and Lauren Halsey is there's sort of this cacophonous thing that they both have. I mean, I'm thinking of like that second to last room of the Mike Kelly show, which was just like everything everywhere all at once. And Lauren Halsey definitely has that same thing going on where you're almost like, what is my focal point? Like
Mm.
where am I supposed to land in this room? I'm not sure. But I think it's interesting because she then went to the East Coast. She went to Connecticut and finished an MFA at Yale in 2014.
So Yale
And
is a really prestigious, it's one of those Ivy League schools, right?
yeah, but I when I think of Yale and the arts, I think of drama.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
There were a couple of encounters, though, that put her on the path of art. And the first was her exposure to funk music, which we talked about. This was, she's on her parents' computer in the early aughts, and she comes across the funk band Parliament on LimeWire. Remember that, folks? For those who aren't familiar with funk music, you have a glorious exploration ahead of you. It's a style that emerged in the late 60s, has its roots in Black empowerment and expression. Parliament is a biggie, but there were lots of bands in sort of the late 60s that were kicking off with Funkadelic, Sly and the Family Stone, Earth, Wind and Fire. I mean, these were enormous bands. Funk is maximalist. So lots of band members, lots of wild outfits, makeup, different characters. None of them had to relate to one another. It was a very slippery gender spectrum that was on
Uh-huh.
clear display. I mean, George Clinton used to wear these long blonde wigs and dresses, and but there was never like a question about his sexuality. It's just this was
Mm.
his expression in the band, and that's that sort of community open aspect really really seemed to speak to Halsey, and and inform her work.
But that openness as well. So I read a review that was kind of fixated on this idea of funkicizing the space, which is
Yeah.
what she proposes to do in her artwork and her installations. And she was expecting music. And the idea of funk, and it took me a while to understand this in Lauren Halsey, is that funk is a philosophy of life, is this idea of not having a fixed structure, that then you have to hold on to. There's an interview in the catalogue with the two curators, Obrist and Lizzie Carey-Thomas, and they are trying to understand what is the project, because the basis of this exhibition is that she wants to develop a sculpture park in South Central LA. And the last answer is her saying, I don't know. I don't want to be held to any plan. I want to see what people are doing. This is a live thing in the present, in the now. And so I need to remain open to that. And that was fascinating.
Yeah, I know, I know. I think it's really special. The second kind of point that helped her put her on a path of being an artist was she met a fellow LA artist called Dominique Moody. And this inspired an interest in architecture and inspired me to look up Dominique Moody, and was a very satisfying trip down an internet rabbit hole. So go and check her out as well. Really interesting artist. Halsey said, I knew I didn't want to become an architect with a capital A, but I thought I could navigate the language of architecture through art. So she was drawn to ancient Egyptian expressions of heritage through architecture. So of course there's obelisks, and you think of Cleopatra's Needles, Sphinx as examples that can help tell the story of the people for their history and their hopes for the future. And Halsey was inspired to do this for her community in South Central LA, primarily by building community gardens in vacant lots.
There was also, because there was so many rabbit holes in this
Yeah.
investigation.
Wasn't
So,
there? I don't know, more than most, right? I just
more
feel
than
like
most.
there was just so much exploration, unique amalgamation of what sort of puts an artist together, or, their world.
The other influences she talks about is her dad, and the connection between her dad's headspace, the way he thinks, the way he connects things, and Sun Ra.
There's a great video of her working on a piece, one of these community gardens in a vacant lot. And this lot is on a corner in a massive, kind of LA intersection. It looks like where a big box store might have been at one point. Across the way, you can see a Macy's and a giant parking lot, and you can imagine what she built within that, with celebration of South Central culture and how that is juxtaposed in those, super commercial, super LA consumerist kind of spaces. And it's actually injecting a bit of like, what is the history that is behind that place. I mean, as she says, her family's lived there for generations, as part of the Great Migration that
Since in the 20s, a whole century of a progression in that history for the Black community, where they arrived from the eastern South, let's say, and they migrated there obviously from a very segregated space, in the hopes of getting more freedom, more work. And that's when her family arrived there. And then progressively, South Center LA became a place where the Black community thrived, grew. Now there's also a Latino community. So there really is a community that started in the 20s, lived segregation, built their own community in that space, that is now really thriving, as Lauren Halsey shows us. That stimulates her to imagine her family coming in, her parents as well. The Central Avenue, which was also historically connected to music, how what would have happened there in the 60s, and that's very much something that really, really feeds her imagination, but also makes her work. So she talks about the fact that everyone has a garden over there, and that the
yeah.
first sculptures she did, and she made for the Hammer Museum, and the first exhibitions she had were made in that garden by the family and the friends with her. Because she was thinking about that garden and what that space could be, and how it could be a communitarian space. So
I mean, LA used to be a Mexican city. Like, it started off.
Los Angeles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the Latino community has been there literally forever. But yeah, so we have funk, we have architecture and community, specifically South Central LA, all oozing out of Lauren Halsey's art. And in the podcast interview, she talked about how when she made art in the beginning, especially, she required so much help from her family, parents, cousins, her brother, established this principle of community in art.
I should mention, as the art specialist here, her career was born in 87. So she has had quite the career in terms of institutional projects. Obrist mentions the fact that him and Lizzie Carey-Thomas discovered her work at the MoCA in Los Angeles, so the Museum of Contemporary Art, where in 2018 she was invited to do a show that she called We Still Here There. And it's very close to what we have at the Serpentine, with a very big environment with these kind of fake rocks and mounds and corners, with a lot of archival stuff that she collects and then places and collages into the space. Another highlight, I think, that is quite connected to her project here is the Roof Garden Commission at the Met in New York in 2023.
Yeah, that's a great one. And just to say, there's some great videos about that on YouTube that I really encourage people to check out.
It's called The East Side of South Central Los Angeles Hieroglyph Prototype Architecture 1. And it is, again, this idea that what she's doing are prototypes for this dream she has of building a sculpture park in South Central Los Angeles for the community, with the community, in the community. And finally, I have to mention, so in 2024, last year, she was part of the Venice Biennale, the 60th Venice Biennale in the Arsenale, which was actually the first place where you had mass production. So the Arsenale was a very long building where you built ships, and it was kind of like we have now in like in a factory when you have things that are in the line of production. And apparently, I think in the 17th century, 16th century, you could build a boat in a day at the end of that line. So that was it's interesting to know that we talk about mass production related to the Industrial Revolution, but actually, but the ships are so connected with colonization, capitalism.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
And so she, in that context, has this project called Keepers of the Crown. And these are a couple of pillars that are these columns that she takes from and she borrows from Egyptian ancient architecture, where they're very monolithical, and at the top they have these faces exactly in the style of Egyptian sculpture, and they all bear faces of her family and friends. And they are engraved as well, like Egyptian monuments, so kind of reliefs, but they have words that come from her culture, her community. Like I'm looking at the picture now, like Black Thang, pride, expressions of community that you also find in the exhibition. So she's had these really beautiful landmarks in her career, and that took her to the Serpentine Gallery, where we discovered her in the UK for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think just to add to that, she has the Summer Everything project in LA, which she started in 2019, which is a community center.
That said, I think we're ready for a break. We've introduced Lauren Halsey, so we'll be with you in a little while.
Welcome back from the break. I think you're going to bring us into this exhibition, right?
Yes, I will. You push the doors and it's an explosion.
It is. Yeah. Explosion is exactly the right word. Yeah.
So it's an explosion of decorative objects and obsessive making, gluing, stacking, cutting, collaging. You're immersed in a universe that hits you as being super specific, and as
Mhm.
specific, I imagine, as it is foreign to you if you're not familiar with the community Laura Halsey represents here. So chances are, for most of us, this will be a new experience. You move across it clockwise, which is an unusual direction in the South Gallery. So you perform a sort of circular walk through three
Mhm.
rooms, right, including the entrance.
Yeah, and just to say, like, that entrance, the spectrum of the types of objects that are in there. I mean, you go in and there's, like, the on the floor, there are rugs that you would find in a home, you
Hmm.
know? I mean, one of them is depicting children, it looks like they're praying, and then there's lots of kind of animal, skin kind of rugs around, and so you go from, like, this domestic sphere to things that should be outside, like sphinx and, you know, big animals and sculptures that you could imagine in very large scale, but you see them in miniature scale here. And then the wallpaper is outer space. You know, so it's like you are going from, like, you know, sitting around someone's coffee table almost, you know, that you could imagine sitting on one of these rugs, to outer space. I mean, it is just such a big spectrum of time and space that she's representing.
Totally. And the entrance is very dark, so as if like
Mhm.
really giving that impression of interior. And the reason why you go clockwise, it's because that last room, which I always find a very difficult room, it kind of creates a lull in the
Mm.
exhibition. That first room has a long, long wall. It's kind of a corridor like, and it has a long wall to the left with windows. So it has a
Mhm.
very specific connection to the garden. And the idea for Lauren Halsey was really to think of Kensington Gardens as something that you don't have over where she comes from that much. And it's such a feature in the city.
Mm.
And it really makes a connection between the way you are in a garden and the way you are supposed to experience the exhibition. The exhibition becomes a place where you spend time, you observe, but you're also immersed in an atmosphere as if you were, you know, doing a stroll and spending some time in a garden.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And so there's that kind of conversation going on there, which also took place in the Met rooftop garden that she created. That was very much in conversation with Central Park, which was right there.
Hmm.
And, you know, she was thinking about what parts of the structures people would actually be able to see from the park. And, you know, there's Cleopatra's Needle, and she's doing, you know, kind of something in response to that, a little bit of call and answer. And so, yeah, so that's definitely something she's played with before.
Definitely. So suddenly the exhibition space has become a very involving urban area where you can relax. You
Hmm.
know, you can chat, you can look around you. There's even a little fountain in the central space, so the central room of the Serpentine South Gallery, which is also the most gregarious. It's really where people spend time. There are at least two places to sit,
Hmm.
but I read in one of the reviews that you weren't allowed to, but then I saw someone do it.
Me too. And
And
I did scratch my head. I was like, I don't know if that's legal. Waiting for the police to come in and cuff them, you know?
after our experiences and
Yeah.
my recent Hayward Gallery experiment, I'm heretofore uninterested in physical contact with the artworks. That's
Uh,
over for me.
yeah, yeah.
So this relation with the garden is great to know because so that's also in the text at the entrance. You learn
Hmm.
that that was one of the inspirations, as well as the funkicizing of the space. Um, because, I mean, if you are confused by maximalist decorations, you may not get that. So when I talked about explosion, it is a maximalist environment in the strictest sense of the word. Even the window panes have color.
Yeah.
And so there's pink, I think there's blue as well. So to be very honest with you, if I hadn't read that there was a relationship with the garden, I don't think I would have even looked outside, because
Yeah.
there's so much stuff. I mean, even the floor is elevated by a structure that is a sort of mosaic-like structure with transparent glass,
Hmm.
which I'm presuming is perspex, and you can see through. And underneath your feet, you're basically walking over lots of a paraphernalia of
Mm.
objects.
Palm trees, toy cars, images of people, signage, stickers. Yeah, absolutely. And that's all underneath your feet, as well as the huge amounts that are sort of on the walls and around you,
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to look at. There's a CD covered room forming a sort of fish scale pattern.
which I
There are
love.
shop signs.
Yeah.
There's collages of children, people, so from cuttings of photos or newspapers or magazines. There are statues, there are green plants, sculptures made of resin, a bit like you would find in fun fairs. One of them is a black child sporting basketball clothes. So I knew that Halsey wanted to be a basketball player in her teens. There's a video of a street view with people playing and passing that's quite blurry at the end of that corridor, like first room. There are lots of pyramidal fixtures, often covered in mirrors, with words written across them, but also other objects such as free person or my hood. There are
Mhm.
lots and lots of symbols of blackness, from the hair to the long manicured nails in sculpture form as a fountain. And so you know that all of this represents a specific place and a specific community.
Yeah, absolutely. I gotta say two things. So I went there after the sun had set. So it was after 4:30.
At
So
the
it was
4:30
dark.
at the moment in the UK,
Exactly.
yes.
So it was really dark. So I didn't get that sense of the light coming through those windows. So I didn't notice the color on the windows at all. I didn't even really notice the windows, to be honest, because it was so dark
Yes.
outside. And that fountain was not working when I was there.
Same.
I
Same.
okay, yeah,
Okay.
so I didn't even kind of clock that it was a fountain. It was one of the most captivating kind of sculptures in the whole exhibition, I would say.
Yes.
I was really kind of found myself, you know, settling in on that for a long time. But yeah, it wasn't until I read some of the reviews and saw some pictures of it actually acting like a fountain that I was like, "Oh, I didn't see that."
Yeah, and
Oh,
there
well.
isn't that sound element that is talked
Mm,
about in the reviews. Yeah, for sure.
mm,
This is where I was confronted with my complete ignorance of this context. And also, I think, with my own identity as a person who will not relate from the inside to this environment created, because Lauren Halsey is very specific. She's a queer woman, and she's very specific about her projects being about Blackness, about her own community, but also the fact that in many of the spaces, of course, brown and Black people will see themselves in this space. So that was really apparent. And also my ignorance of LA. So I've never been there, and my relation with this side of LA, perhaps a bit further south, is with Inglewood, which is at times mentioned in Halsey's collages and installations. I noticed through Issa Rae's series Insecure. I don't know if you've watched that.
no, uh-uh.
So this aesthetic is really unfamiliar to me, and so I was, as I was in the space, I was trying to place it, and I kept being reminded of my kids' Guinness record books, because they have lots of metallic, glittery, shiny
Yeah.
surfaces, neon greens and yellows. And the catalog is exactly that. It has this kind of shiny lettering and font that is very round and curved.
Yeah, and I gotta say, just like that room with the CDs all over, I just loved it was just you're bathed in iridescent light, and I loved that about it, the shininess.
Yeah, and there's this aspect of the iridescence of these materials that also kind of points to the idea of layering and of
Hmm.
kind of the reality being made of folds and of different aspects. The same space has different aspects to it and has
Hmm.
different readings and different relations and different connections to it, which is really beautiful because you know that it comes from recuperated materials and makeshift constructions and handcrafted things. Because I mean, Lauren Halsey is a maker. She is
Yeah,
an
yeah.
archivist, as she says so herself. She goes around the neighborhood, she collects things, she buys these. For example, there's these animal toys or animal miniatures that she buys from people in the street that are made by people there. And she was kind of thinking, okay, these will be the animals of the park. And so she collected them. She really sees herself as a visual material culture archivist. And I think that's really important. So for me, it immediately connoted as American, which I know is such a horrible reduction because America is made of so many things.
Yeah.
But just to say that it felt like something very far. And also you could see that there was these kind of icons. So you have Lionel Richie, which
Yeah.
made me crack up.
Yeah, in kind of a lengthy sort of side laying pose with one knee up. It was good. Sort of very
A,
80s sweater going on. Yeah.
atop one of those rock seats kind of structures,
Yeah.
but very small.
I know.
And then you have lots of images of people from the neighborhood. You learn that some of them have passed away as well. There's some
Mm,
hardship as well. And they're there a bit like angels in
mm.
Christian iconography, where you don't know where they come from as a spectator, obviously, like us. Other people will know very well who they are, and that's the richness of this proposal. And for you, there are kind of these beautiful, joyful, smiling creatures hovering around those saints, which are the known um, icons that are there as well. There's kind of all that community in there placed in a way that is very joyful and very playful, and at the same time connected to making, obsessive
Yeah.
collecting and making.
I can imagine what her basement looks like, just full of stuff. You know, I mean, just absolutely chock full of objects that have inspired her at one time or another, and will play a role in something that she makes, at some point.
There's another aspect to it that I realized later. She's concerned with an experience she had when she was a kid, where she would move out of South Central LA to school, and she would see the difference in neighborhoods where there were streets with no protections, and then there was a part where shops seem to be protected from violence and seem to expect violence, and economic difference between those neighborhoods. And therefore, when you enter this space, there's also something that is an important aspect to everything she collects, which is that nothing is precious. The only precious thing that you might think would be an expensive thing or something unattainable is written. It's not the object itself, is Gucci, which obviously is kind of also
Yeah.
connoted with a certain blackness, with a certain style, with a certain street style. But it's written as a sort of a slogan rather than being represented by stuff. So the stuff that is there is cheap stuff. It's stuff that is made of plastic, and even the kind of rocky mounds that she produces, they're white and they bear lots of iridescent colors, that very neon bright colors, and they look plastic. As you know, I am quite baffled by maximalism. Not intellectually, but like sensorially, really. And we talked about this during the Daido Moriyama episode. I get really overwhelmed. I don't know what to look at, how I feel. I think my brain just stops. And I was feeling a bit, discombobulated in the space. And I was there with my friend Liberté, with whom we did the episode about art advising, Liberté Nuti. And she said the word utopia. And
Hmm.
suddenly it kind of constellated the utopia, the dream, the megalomaniac, nonsensical idea of bringing a whole culture, a whole neighborhood, a whole group of people, a whole self determining, self affirming ethos into a context that is completely disconnected from it. And of course, geographically, but when you say geographically, everything else gets dragged into it. In Kensington, old school, old values, tradition,
Hmm.
knowledge, museums. And then there's the Serpentine, sponsored by Dior and the Luma Foundation. It's a whole context. And it feels like a utopia. And the title of the show, which is written in this kind of slangy kind of way of writing in English in many communities. So imagine that. So it's dream this.
Hmm.
And so there's uh, suddenly this idea of this self-described archival impulse behind the project, which actually makes me think of Villegley's collection of revolutionary and protest signs amalgamated in his
Yeah,
drawings.
yeah.
But there's no sublimation here. So there's no, I'm going to take this and put it into drawing form and appropriate it for myself. Here, this is a sort of Madame Tussauds of South Central LA. She talks about human sized maquettes. So these projects are maquettes that you can go into. And so the question for me here was like, how do I, see this, connect with
Hmm.
it? Is it culturally? Is it an aesthetic? And I would also be intrigued, to see how English, Black and brown, young, middle aged, older people from different backgrounds connected to it. So, yeah, so that was kind of the question for me there and then, in the exhibition. I'm curious to know how you experienced it.
So first of all, I want to thank Liberté for utopia because I think that is a word that captures it. And it's funny because it is described that way. I mean, Afrofuturism is also something that runs through Halsey's work. And she talks about, having this sort of idealized representation of where she's from, in part because of what you mentioned in terms of going to other neighborhoods and seeing how things are different and that gentrification that's happening in South Central LA. She wants to resist that and make sure that there's a canon where this time and place of her upbringing is captured and preserved. But yeah, I so when I saw the exhibition online, I was really excited. I was like, wow, I'm going to be going into another place and I'm going to have this very, fully sensorial experience of, South Central LA as she offers it. And so I was really excited about it, and I went there, and those doors opened, and I felt overwhelmed as well. I felt like there was so much to look at. There were so many suggestions that I was looking for a focal point of, like, something to help me latch onto to make sense of these animal skin rugs and the outer space that was happening on the wallpaper, etc. And I had a hard time locating that. And so it was like, okay, I'm just gonna take a breath and just be here. And this is how I feel right now. There's often that kind of chatter that goes on in my head when I first enter an exhibition, which is like deciding whether or not I want to like it or not right there and then, and that's it. And I kind of got to ride that out anyway. But walking through that second room, the long room where there was the video of these people dancing in the street at the end of the room, that felt like a focal point, and that gave me a bit more. That gave me something to kind of hold on to and to understand, where the signs were coming from, etc. And the last room, I really, really enjoyed. I think that those I think that look, this is supposed to be a park, right? This is supposed to be a space where people come and hang out. And I almost wish there were just more benches
Mm,
because it felt like the kind of thing that needed that. And
mm.
like you, I was afraid to sit down. There was a young woman sitting there, and there was this part of me that was like, "Oh, they're going to get you," like, but they didn't. Obviously, I wanted somewhere to linger because there is so many suggestions and so many things where you're like, I wonder what that is about, and where you kind of need to make sense of it. That I think that those benches would have been really, really helpful to sort of allow people to relax and really become infused in the space. So when I was there, I felt kind of, you know, yeah, as I say, kind of uncertain about it and uncertain about what I made about it. Going away and doing more research on her, gives a lot of context. And I think that some exhibitions don't need a lot of context. And I think this one would have helped me more, which is why a repeat visit, I think, is absolutely necessary.
There are expectations that you have through the exhibition text about the funk, about the park, about the way you'll be in that exhibition that are confusing because the exhibition for me was an experience of looking. It wasn't an
Yeah.
experience of spending time. It was an experience of discovering more than an experience of spending time in the place, observing, playing, talking, like you would have in a park. And I really thought long and hard about it because I was definitely thinking of this idea of bringing a community. So, the difference between the previous episode, Zanele Maholi, who also brings their own community as a non binary, queer, Black artist in South Africa, taking pictures of people from South Africa, bringing them into the museum, and then doing the self portraiture of their own body and enacting some things in the photographs. For me, there's a storytelling there. And in this situation, there's again a Black queer artist who identifies as female, who brings to the forefront of the iconography Blackness and and the culture of that huge group in the world, very located in a city within a big city, so a very small part of that city, but the meaningful part for her and for her community. And it's brought as a maquette, so it's brought as real size things. So it is an environment. It's not storytelling. It is a sort of simulacrum of a space that is not known to you as a spectator in the UK, and that was voluntary. That was the goal. The goal was not to tell stories. One of the things that I was a bit surprised by is that if you don't do the research around the exhibition, and that's why I've talked about angels, um, you see people, you know that they're people from the community. You see them, you don't know who they are, you don't know the stories behind them, and that's voluntary. There's no explanation of the context. There's a real want to focus on the community and not to bring, like Zanele Muholi brings at a certain point, an individual perspective into
Mm,
it. And that's kind of what was missing for me, going back to Benjamin Péret's text, which is poetry is unconnected at ultimately, which is a European stance that he had against futurism, against communism, saying, you know, poetry and art in general is the space of irreverence. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that I was so baffled by the this ability to adhere completely to an aesthetic and an identity.
mm,
Whereas with Zanele Maholi, there was this diversity of the LGBTQIA plus community that was showcased there. There was their experience then as a subject of photography. And here it is like this thing of adhering completely as a person. So I misunderstood that, because it's not an identity thing. It's a community. It's a group of
Yeah.
people. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with the identity of the artist. And when you hear the artist speak, there's really this concern, first and foremost, ultimately across the whole work, with an iconography, with but a life, a real
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
in the present. And that's something that is interesting, because I would say that here the revolutionary, the irreverence is brought by the space. It's not the artwork in itself, but it's the fact of placing that community in that space that
Mm.
automatically turns that work into something much freer, especially in a place where you don't adhere as a spectator. I imagine in great part the people who go there, I mean, in majority, I can't tell you the exact percentage, but museums and galleries have to study the profiles of their visitors. Great majority white.
Mm.
There's a white spectatorship in this
Sure.
space. Um, and that is really interesting. And I think that's exactly, for me, the core of that project, which for me as a white woman, a European white woman, became about thinking about that gesture, not as much the experience in the space, but really thinking about that. And I came across this really interesting article in The Guardian yesterday while doing my research by a social analyst called um, I'm looking at the article right now. So the title is "Are We a Racist Society? The majority of us say no, but science begs to differ." And so his name's Keon West. He's the author of Science of Racism, and it is a truly beautiful article. So he's a social psychologist. That's who he is. And he talks about the fact that if you ask people whether they're racist or not, they will say no.
Yeah.
But how can you measure racism? And he claims that there is a measuring that is quite, objective. Studies made with would CVs go on top of the pile and
Yeah.
under the pile. Black people have to send 50 times more CVs to have the same number of
Mm.
calls than a white person. So he numbers like a very objective examples of that, the very crude reality. And in museums, it's the same thing. The spectatorship is mainly white. And he talks about unconscious racism and how undermining that expression is. So there's
Mm.
unconscious racism, and there's, on the other hand, implicit racism, because when you talk about unconscious racism, tests were done as well, scientific ones, that you forgive yourself
Mm.
because it is unconscious. So you're not the master of it, you inherited it. Whereas implicit means that it's there and you have to be accountable for it. I
Mm.
situate myself immediately there. And I think that's a wonderful, thing to experience and to dig into and to understand exactly the gesture of doing that, of bringing this community there, and also enjoying the joy of it. There is a lot
Mm.
of joy in
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
There is no victimization.
Wow. Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you. And I mean, I think eh, so well said too. Thank you for that. That's that articulation of the difference between Maholi's perspective and what she's bringing through storytelling, and what Halsey is bringing through atmosphere and, experience of being in a place. That is really important, because I did find myself comparing the two, and I
Mm,
wasn't sure why. I wasn't sure why I felt like I wanted Maholi's, but I think you've nailed it. It is because she's telling me a story, and she's bringing me in a way that is very different. There's a side door that Lauren Halsey is going through that is about, here's the community and all of its wonder, and you can be here for a while. It's a place rather than a story. So thank you. That's really helpful. And that whole thing of racism, and that it's not a choice that only abhorrent people make.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
is it
You
is
have to
just
include yourself in that narrative as a
it's
white person.
in absolutely. It is
Mm,
just in the water we drink, unfortunately.
mm,
Yeah, is a really important thing to remember. Wow, brilliant.
mm,
Great. So, I mean, I think there's this issue of Afrofuturism and Afropessimism that's alive in her work. And you did some digging into that, didn't you?
I did, yes, because so we've had an experience of Afro pessimism through the Ariadne exhibition at the
Mm.
ICA last year, and we had to look into that a little bit. I also went to during the pandemic when the museums reopened to the Toyin Oji Odutola exhibition at the Curve Space at the Barbican. She's a Nigerian American artist who was very much inspired by Afrofuturism. So that's the first time I came across that term. The exhibition was incredible. It was these charcoal drawings based on a fiction of a mythical community in the African continent that was a matriarchy, and the men did the labor, and the drawings were fantastic. There was music. It was a really beautiful show. In the interview of the catalog, Lauren Halsey does mention that as something in the beginning that inspired her, because George Clinton, the funk movement was very much, Sun Ra as well, connected to that notion. So, from the Tate website, the term Afrofuturism is explained. So, I'm going to quote straight from that. The term Afrofuturism has its origins in African American science fiction. Today, it is generally used to refer to literature, music, and visual art that explores the African American experience, and in particular, the role of slavery in that experience. Central to the concept of Afrofuturism are the science fiction writers Octavia Butler, Samuel R. Delany, and the jazz musician Sun Ra, who created a mythical persona that merged science fiction with Egyptian mysticism. It is this otherness that is at the heart of Afrofuturism. Those inspired by Afrofuturism include the musician George Clinton, the artist Ellen Gallagher, and the film director Wanuri Kayu. So I thought that probably Lauren Halsey's work could be linked to that. And so just to counterbalance and bring a whole panorama of these discourses and these terms, when we explored Afro-pessimism, we situated it in the popularization of that term by Frank B. Wilderson III, who grew up in Minneapolis.
Nice.
Emily
Hometown boy.
from
Nice.
it. He's a neighbor. So this theory, Afro-pessimism, explains that racism against Black peoples is so deeply rooted that it's almost impossible to overcome. And so there's this kind of toing and froing between one and the other. I found an article of Kadish Morris's about this American poet called Danez Smith, who goes from one to the other. So from Afrofuturism to Afropessimism in his two books. One is called Don't Call Us Dead. It was very lauded, won several prizes, where the idea is imagining a world liberated from anti-Blackness. And then in his recent book called Bluff, there's an almost Afro-pessimist take, according to the Guardian journalist. You know, he's from George Floyd's hometown, and the book is very much traversed by that and what came about in the aftermath of that. So there's this kind of toing and froing, as if Afro-pessimism and Afro-futurism was kind of like a sort of two ends of a very complex spectrum of the reality of Blackness, particularly in America. I would really urge you to read these books.
Mm.
I was almost going to read two poems one from each book because it's so incredible writing. It's also graphic poetry. There's one called Dinosaurs in the Hood, where he imagines, so they imagine, because they're non-binary as well, they imagine the Jurassic Park, but only in blackness so they go over all the tropes of the black character that dies all the time in thrillers. The first is always the first victim, etc. And they imagine a Jurassic Park that is completely devoid of all those kind of containing and crushing tropes for blackness. And then in the poem Anti-Poetica, in the recent book Bluff, a lot of the lines are, a poem cannot feed you, a poem cannot solve the social injustice. And he almost apologizes in the book for having been so utopian. So, and then in the catalogue, just to close this chapter up, there is a text called Against Afrofuturism it's a very angry text by Harmony Holiday. And it's a really interesting text where Harmony talks about the fact that thinking about the future takes away the responsibility of the now and takes away your agency. And also, by the way, the term, and that's why, Tate, if you're listening, please change your website. Harmony Holiday says something really critical, which is that Afrofuturism was coined by a white scholar in the 90s and was developed in a book where one of the people interviewed is the Delaney, the writer mentioned in the Robert Delaney in the Tate website. It's a really difficult read. I read some bits of it. And another thing that Harmony Holiday doesn't do is to name the author, just not to give that person a platform. So I dug up and I kind of checked the source. I was like, really? So the person who coined this term is Mark Derry, who's an American cultural critic, writer, and lecturer. And in 1993, he coined the term for a book of interviews. And so he was the one who named that. And so
that really surprises me. I would have guessed that it would have been much further back than the 90s.
Yes, me too.
You know, I'm surprised it's as recent as that. That's really interesting.
I was very confused by Harmony Holiday's text that starts, "The West is resolutely doctrinaire, and the invention of a shiny new doctrine often reinvigorates the indomitable colonial impulse, subtly or otherwise. Under the dictatorship of the most effective doctrine, the will of a group of discrete individuals is often trained on one aesthetic genre, whether or not its protagonists agree. Such is the case with Afrofuturism, a term and doctrine coined by a white academic in the 1990s to help make sense of Black science fiction, which has since been deployed to collapse the work of disparate Black artists and thinkers into one oversimplified silo." So the text is really interesting and quite indomitable itself.
Right.
So just to finish and to close up this contextualization, I guess, and also kind of this education, Harmony Holiday makes a case for this idea of agency and being in the now, which we also talked about regarding Zanelli Moholy, which is they're doing the work now in the community and not just documenting it or bearing witness. They are actively engaging with change and trying to promote change, namely through activism or community-oriented projects. And that's something that the term Afrofuturism cannot encapsulate and cannot destroy. And so at the end, Harmony Holiday writes, "Knowing this, and from the vantage of the renewed paradigm, Lauren Halsey's work, which belongs first to South Central Los Angeles and then to the collective imagination of that place as a myth, and then to the use of myth to render the reality there anew by inflecting it with tones it already carries quietly and unceremoniously, can be seen as a blueprint for a new now. If we refuse to displace her vision onto the future, what is her testimony about the current of Black desire and pleasure and friendship today, right now, as you read this? How does her friendship with George Clinton guide her building of funk mounds and stages for him that can fit into her hometown today? And why is this work exhibited in museums and galleries without being brought directly to urban planners? How can her fantastic become part of the Black mundane and real? And will the circle be unbroken? Will you seek entry into that real at its most unglamorous and functional, risk vanity to be there, or attend only as it becomes art object and simulation? If you can only process the Black everyday by pretending it lives outside of time, then love is absent, and you, as a spectator, become a grim reaper and thief. Halsey's work resists that, or forces us to confront it, entering to the tune of America Eats Its Young and leaving in the song's mouth.
Wow, that is, yeah, goodness. Afrofuturism, born in the 1990s from a white scholar. That blows my mind. I mean, so I just looked up the National Museum for African American Heritage. It's in DC.
Yes, yeah.
And there's a curator there who's talking. I mean, he talks about Afrofuturism. He doesn't. He just says that it was originally coined in scholarly circles to explore how Black writers and artists have utilized themes of technology, science fiction, fantasy, and heroism to envision stories and futures. I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering, like, is she 100% on that identification of it being born in 1993?
Yes, yes. I've looked into it, and
Really?
what I saw, and again, admittedly, I didn't read the whole book, just saw some excerpts, and there was
Sure.
this kind of thing of like, how come Black American authors haven't explored fiction? I mean, or science fiction. I mean, it would seem to be the ideal place for Black identity to expand because it would be creating a new world from scratch and therefore affirming themselves, which is
Yeah.
a great idea, but it's not your place to have it, and certainly
Yeah.
not to question a Black author about that. And it also speaks to a huge ignorance. I mean, I only knew Octavia Butler or of Octavia Butler a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
never heard of
Yeah.
her before.
Me too. Yeah.
And, and even Ursula K. Le Guin, learned about her very late, earlier than Octavia Butler. So, Black, white science fiction authors emerge, and later Black female
Mm.
authors emerge. There's always this cadence of white
Mhm.
feminists, and then, or white
Mm.
female whatever, and then the same category but with a different ethnicity comes later. So there's this pattern really in the culture. So it was the author himself who didn't know about the reality of science fiction, having been explored already
Yeah.
before he had the crazy idea that it would be appropriate to, So that's the criticism. I'm talking about what I read partially on the winterwebs. So again, take this with a grain of salt. Do your own research,
Yeah.
as I will continue to do mine. Yeah. So that was kind of like my huge rabbit hole. And in the meantime,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
discovered the new poet, Danis Smith. Go into it, read it. It's beautiful.
Wow, brilliant. I mean, there's just so many questions and so much to explore off the back of this exhibition, of Lauren Halsey's work. And I mean, God, she's young. There's so much more that's going to be coming from her, and more things that she can bring to us in the wider world from her very unique and really special point of view from her community. So that's just fabulous. And thank you, Joanna. I mean, this has been just a fantastic conversation. And I've really enjoyed hearing your articulation of the difference between Maholi's exhibition and Halsey's exhibition, resonance in a very, very different way. So thank you for that.
Well, it was my pleasure. And it was a pleasure chatting with you as ever. Apologies if I misread, misquoted, misinterpreted any of the things that I talked about that concern a community that is certainly not mine. Lauren Halsey, thank you for making me do this. Thank you, Serpentine, for having this exhibition that really, really questioned a lot of things. And I will certainly be going back. And you still have time to do so as well. If you're in London, it's open until the 23rd of February. So that's it. It's there for you. And if not, Lauren Halsey, I'm sure, is very young, has other things coming up in your hometown, in your country, for sure. But more specifically and more importantly, in South Central LA, may she continue to build that community, support it, and expand it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Take care. See you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye.